Hello, Endersword here again, this time with a video on ship-to-ship combat. This one's going to focus mostly on PvE. I think I'll do another PvP one just before incursions come out later this week. But was talking to a few people in my own alliance, and we often go over battle logs and stuff like that. And I realized the number of people that don't really fully get what the math is behind it or what the actual mechanics are that is driving whether the numbers are good, bad, or whatever, that are really going to allow you to make good adjustments in your game, adjust your crew, what to level up on your ship next, things like that, which are pretty important. So I wanted to kind of go over what those mechanics are and then give some examples of how they play out when actually fighting in the game. So the baseline three things I think people know, which is that your ship has a certain amount of hull hit points. Basically, you lose those, you die. That's the thing that determines whether you live or die, is whether or not you have any hull left. That's going to basically be the main driver of how many hostiles you can kill in a given run. And your intent, obviously, in order to fight things efficiently, is going to be to preserve your hull. On the outside of that is going to be the shield hit points. Shields obviously refresh between fights. There's a lot of mechanics in the game that actually make your shield refresh inside the fight itself, such as the morale combination on the Enterprise, Kirk Spock on any other ship. Things like that can actually recharge your shields in a fight itself. And then the outer layer of this is mitigation of damage. So mitigation is where you completely avoid the damage right off the bat before it ever comes in and hits either your shields or your hull. So it's basically, it's weird how they phrase it, because one of the stats is armor, kind of implying that it hits you and you hold off against it. So it kind of implies it hit your hull, but that's not really what's going on. So the three stats there are armor, shield deflection, and dodge. So think of it all as simply avoiding damage outright, as in that shot completely missed you or glanced right off you and took no damage from it whatsoever. So the way that these things play out, a shot comes in from the outside. It first goes through this mitigation round where a huge chunk of it can be completely discarded right out the gate. A remaining percentage, in this case 80% of the remaining damage, gets absorbed by your shield, and then only the small fraction of that that comes through ends up getting to your actual hull. So the percentages on this, someone shoots from the outside, you can mitigate up to 71.2% of that shot right off the bat, and there's not a scratch on you. This depends on what their piercing stats are and what your defense stats are to determine what percentage this is, but it cannot go above 71.2%. That then comes to the shield level, where then 80% of that remaining value is absorbed by your shields. So your shield does go down by whatever that amount of hit points is. Your shield is depleted, and the remaining amount goes through to the hull. So as you can see, if you've got maxed out mitigation, your shield is up and just functioning normally, then you only actually take 5.76% of whatever the original shot is into the hull of your ship. So given some plugged in values here, if they shoot you for 1,000,000 points, then 712,000 of that is mitigated, meaning 288,000 is coming through to your shield. 230.4 of that is then going to be absorbed by the shield. So 230,400 is taken as shield damage, and the remaining amount, which is 57,600, is going to be the thing that actually hits your hull. Now, this is what a lot of people see, and this is what it shows in your battle log. But there is another layer to this that people often disregard, despite the fact that it's actually essential to the main PvE crew in the entire game, the PMC crew and the PMT crews, which is suppression. So before someone even takes a shot, there are certain officers that will actually suppress damage or piercing done by the enemy ship. so they can lower the damage right out the gate before the enemy ship ever actually takes a shot. So that's what an officer like Chen or Talan does, which is lowers the enemy's energy weapons by a certain percentage or lowers the enemy's kinetic weapons by a certain percentage. There's other officers in the game, for instance, that will lower the base damage of this opponent versus a certain race, or lowers the base damage that they do against a certain ship type. There's officers that can cause you to delay a round, so just cause a weapon to not fire at all. And there's officers that will lower things like your critical hit percentage or your critical hit damage percentage. So all those things are kind of forms of suppressing the damage your opponent can do before they ever get the actual shot off and before it comes into these inner layers of it. So if we take a look at how some of this plays out, I went out and did a bunch of battles. Let me find the original one here. I wanted to take a look. If I went out with a D4, which is, you know, a mid-tier ship for me, and just stuck essentially no crew on it. So I just stuck 3 miners on there. None of these guys affect combat in any way whatsoever. And I wanted to see what would happen. What are my initial stats on this ship, assuming that I've got no officer abilities and no captain abilities. And I went out and found a level 50 Jem'Hadar battleship. So it's within the battle triangle. I'm on the right side of it. It's kind of at a disadvantage, but if we take a look at the battle logs here, then we can see what percentage I'm mitigating and what percentage it is mitigating. And then we can say, okay, now what direction do I want to go in to perform better in this fight? So the way that you determine what your mitigation actually is to take the amount that you are taking in damage and divide it by the initial shot that it put out. So in this first round, I am mitigating 114,606 damage, and I'm going to divide that by the number 251,977. And I'm getting that I have a 45.48% mitigation rate. So that can go up to 71.2 if I have better officers, better stats, better research, whatever it is, just a better ship at play. So I am not mitigating out the major part, a major part of this. I'm kind of leaving on the table. So a lot more of this value is then getting through to my shield. So in this case, if we take their initial shot, 251,977, and I subtract out the amount that I mitigate, I have 137,371 damage that got through my mitigation level. Now, presumably, my shield should be mitigating 80% of that. In this case, very close. I have an actual, a specific extra research that causes me to mitigate 1.5% more in the first 2 rounds of combat. So if I take that out and actually put in 81.5% in the first couple rounds times 81.5, then that's going to give me my exact value, 111,957. You don't unlock that research till 50 plus, so it may not apply to most people, but in general, 80% is what that mitigation is unmodified. And then if I take that value and I subtract out the original 137, whatever it was, then I get down to my 25,000 that I am taking to the hull. So because a lot more of that is getting through the mitigation, I'm taking 25,000, 23, 26 to the hull, 22, 22, 25. So taking about that sort of thing to the hull. These first shots here, the first 2 volleys, are going to be energy weapons. And then every second round, the Jem'Hadar ship will fire these 6 shots in a row, and these are kinetic weapons. So in round number 1, I'm getting 6 shots from energy weapons, 6 shots from a kinetic weapon. In round 2, I'm just going to get the 6 shots from the energy weapon, and he's going to be recharging their kinetic weapons. And again, 6 shots, and then 6 kinetic. And you can see these kinetic ones hit a lot harder. So the percentage will be the same. I'm still mitigating about 45% of this damage. You can probably just see that visually. It's about a little less than half of what that is. And I'm taking more to the hull. So in terms of then damage I am doing to the opponent, let's take a nice round looking one here. Almost 1 million. So it is mitigating 281,516 divided by my total damage that I shot at it. It's only mitigating 28.08% of the damage. It's then absorbing a lot of that in the shields and then taking to the hull 144,000 in this one. Next one I crit, so obviously that's a lot bigger, but the percentages here are basically the same. Well, not even basically the same. They should be exactly the same, minus any rounding error. So the percentage that it's actually mitigating, it's not very good at mitigating my damage. I'm not awesome at mitigating its damage without a crew. So let's see if we put in different crews here. So I'll go to the main crew that probably everyone is used to using, which is the PMC crew. So if we look at what these guys do, Moreau has a negative 70% to armor piercing, shield piercing, and accuracy of hostiles. So what does that do? It doesn't increase my defensive stats. It lowers the offensive stats of the enemy ship. So in this case, it's going to improve my mitigation, but not by increasing my defense, but lowering its offense. What Pike does is add 120% or multiply by 120%, or I guess it is add 120% of that value to the officer abilities when they're in combat. So this 70% is really going to be more than double that. And Chen's ability is to put negative 30% to enemy damage dealt, energy damage dealt by enemy hostiles. And again, that's going to be more than double. It's going to be itself time plus 1.2 times its damage, or its value. So when we look how that plays out in the log here, we can right off the gate see that not only is that clearly pretty effective on the energy weapons, it's way more effective than it says it is. It's way more effective than you would actually think it is. So we saw in that last log, these shots were coming in at about 200,000 in terms of their raw damage coming in. Now that I have Moreau and Chen on there, where Chen lowers the damage that should be coming in the door, you can see that not only is that drastically lowered, it's lowered by more than it should be. So it should be about doubled. It should be like 70-something% that it takes out. In reality, you can see it's taking out over 90% of that energy weapon damage. So it really, really lowers what that is. So if you're fighting a hostile that is going to be using primarily energy weapons, or that's where the majority of their damage is coming from, then that's going to help. Chen is usually the best because if you just randomly choose hostiles in the game, then most of their damage is going to be coming from the energy weapons because they don't need to be reloaded, recharged, or whatever, and they tend to go off every round, whereas the kinetic ones often do not. So if you look at that, we're getting a much, much lower amount, but then when we get down to our kinetic weapons, again, they're just pretty much normal. They're in the 500,000-600,000 range. We get the low values for energy weapons, low values for energy weapons, and then we're into the kinetic again, and they're shooting hard. So basically that's our trade-off there. If we look at what the percentages are that we're now mitigating, it's a much lower value to begin with, but 10,375 divided by the 14,571, we now have the 71.2 plus a rounding error percent mitigation that we're looking for. Then that is taking us down to only 3,400 that the shield is absorbing, and then ultimately only 700 damage is getting to our hull. When we looked in that last battle log, the damage coming to our hull was 25,000, 22,000, 20, like it was a pretty high amount that was actually getting through when we didn't have any of that in place. So the massive difference, you would think mitigating 45% versus 71%, it's big, but it's only like 50% more. But reality is when it trickles through, it's way, way more when it's hitting the hull. And because we don't have Chen on, these initial shots are over, like they're over 10 times more. They're almost 20 times more, actually, in some cases, what the damage was coming through to our Chen crew. So if we make the comparison, there's the 51. If we make the comparison then to what we're actually shooting, then that should be reasonably similar. So if we find one of our shots, here's another one yet again that is close to 1 million that we are shooting out. If we take what it's mitigating, 287,710, and divide it by our shot, we can see that it's mitigating the same, exact same thing. 28.08% is what it's shaving off the top of us. So nothing on the PMC crew is offensive. It doesn't increase the damage or penetration for us, and it doesn't lower the penetration for our, like the defense for our opponent. What it does is lower their ability to penetrate us, and it lowers their ability to fire strong weapons against us. It just cuts the damage out of them by a huge, huge degree. So the other option when you're fighting an opponent is to go with the PMT crew. And the PMT crew, which I hope is the last one I did, here we're again using basically the same two people, but we're swapping in Talon here. Talon, instead of lowering 30% of energy damage, as Chen does, we're now reducing 20% of kinetic damage against enemy hostiles. What this is going to look like is the energy weapons are now back to the mid 200,000s that they were at. But when we get down to the kinetic weapons, these were firing at 500,000 or 600,000, and they're now cut to the 200,000s. So they're now basically in line with the rest of the energy weapons, and it's cutting that down. So what you want to do in deciding which one to go with is look at the ship type that you're actually facing, and then determine, does it tend to do more of its damage via the energy or the kinetic? And which one of these should I be using for that purpose? So as you can see, as a percentage, Chen is going to cut a whole lot more than Talon does. But given that ships that fire kinetic weapons tend to hit a lot harder with them, it can often be 2, 3, 4, 5 times as hard as the others. Then you want to look at when is that appropriate. And in a general sense, that is most appropriate when you're fighting something like swarms is a really good example, where most of their damage is being done by the kinetic weapons, and so that's what you want to be mitigating down. So look at your ship type, look at the enemy ship type, look at what their firing patterns are. Unfortunately, it doesn't just straight out tell you in the game, these are energy, these are kinetic, but you can figure that out. One, in the order of the battle log, the kinetic are usually at the bottom. And you can figure it out by swapping in Chen, swapping in Talon, and seeing which one they actually mitigate there. And for player ships, you can find firing patterns online. Armadas, you can find firing patterns, things like that. They tend to repeat the same thing over and over. So figure out what you're fighting and then determine what the best thing actually is. Now, there is another crew option here, which people are kind of forced to use once they go above level 51, once you're fighting things above that. But you can use before that too, if the situation is appropriate. And that is the S&W crews. So in this case, we've got S&W Pike, and he does a couple interesting things here. He puts 14% additional to your own shield mitigation. So I said earlier that your shield usually defaults to 80%. He's going to raise that additively to 94%. He will also lower the opponent's hostiles shield mitigation by 25%. So whenever they say this stuff, and I know that this was confusing to me at the beginning, if you told me that shield mitigation would go up by 14%, I would assume you meant the current shield mitigation and then multiply that by 1.14, and that's what it would be. It's not like that. It's usually additive or subtractive. So in this case, your shield mitigation is 80%. He's going to increase it with full synergy on him. He's going to increase it to 94%. So it is strictly, literally add that number on to what your shield mitigation is. And then on the flip side, do the opposite. That it's going to take the opponent's shield mitigation of 80% and it's going to lower that to 55%. The hammer here is if you're fighting surveys. So any ship that he's on, he's going to increase what your defense stats are when you're fighting a hostile survey. That's not what we're doing today. So he's just there to help provide synergy for Pike. And then the ship type ones, which is Uhura, Ortegas, and what's the third one there? Una, Lon? I forget. No, Spock. Spock, of course, for the explorers. So Una, Uhura, Spock, and Ortegas, depending on what your ship type is. And what she's going to do is increase the armor, shield, deflection, and dodge by 18% of what your, or 1,800% of what your attack is when you are specifically attacking battleships. So in these types of crews, you're pretty restricted on what ship you can use to attack what. All of them can do the surveys with Hemmer, but then the others are, depends what your ship type is and depends what the enemy ship type is. It has to match. But the way those work, you'll notice these are strictly, these two are strictly defensive. Pike in the middle is defensive in that it adds shield mitigation to you, and it's offensive in that it lowers the shield mitigation of your opponent. So if we look into the battle log here again, you're going to see immediately on the right that our damage taken is completely full again. So there's no suppression of what the enemy ship is doing, but there is increased mitigation for ourselves, and there is a increased or decreased mitigation from their shields when we're firing offensively. So in this particular case, we're going to look again, and I assume this is maxed out, 192, 389, divided by the initial damage that it does give me 71.19998. So yeah, basically the 71.2, it is maxed out. My shield mitigation, however, if I now take the initial amount, take off the amount that I mitigated outright, and then say what percentage is this. So 77821. So 74319 divided by 77821 should work out for me to be 95.5%. And yeah, it does. So 95.4999. So again, Pike is taking me from 80% to 94, and then additional research that I have is adding that extra 1.5% on top of that. So what's ultimately getting through to my hull here is only 3,502 hull health damage. However, compare that to, even though I'm now at max mitigation and my shield is even mitigating more, because the Jem'Hadar ship is doing literally 20 times more damage in the shot, I'm still taking 3,500 damage to the hull, whereas when I was using the PMC crew, the Chen was lowering this by so much that I was only taking about 700 damage to the hull. So, but then I would still take a lot more with the kinetic weapons later on. So we'll compare those two in a moment. Here, obviously, these are full. So in these cases, I'm taking, you know, let's say 9,000, 10,000, 7, 8, in that ballpark of high 7,000s, depending on whether they crit or not. So yeah, let's say high 7,000s for these 4 that did not crit. And obviously there's variability in damage, but there's not a variability in the percentage that you actually take. But if we now look at a shot that I am firing against them, again, their initial mitigation should be the same. If I take the 301,442 and divide it by the shot that I took, again, right around a million, it's again 28.08. We've seen this exact number before. That's no surprise. But if we now take the amount that was mitigated by the shields, 771, 758. We can see it is doing as predicted, about 55%. Again, I got another 0.5% from research, but 55% of that is now being mitigated instead of the 80% that it should be if we didn't have pike there. So what's getting to the hull here is actually 350,000 damage and 300,000 damage on this. So a shot of about 1 million, and we're getting about 350,000 in. If we rewind back to that PMC crew and look at what was getting through, a shot of about 1 million was only putting 155,000 damage in. So in each shot, I'm taking to the hull way less with Chen here from the energy weapons. But when I put a shot of about 1 million through, I'm getting an extra 200,000 pushed to their hull because of me being able to take out that mitigation. Now on these, where we go into the kinetic shots, here we're taking shots of 500 to 600,000. What's getting through to the hull is 30,000, 30,000, 30,000 up in that ballpark. And if we go back to what our recent, where was this? These guys, and look at approximately what was getting through. Here I'm taking a lot less. So what actually mitigates more depends on what they're going to fire more of. So clearly here I'm taking about 5 times more damage in, and that damage is about 3,500. And then here, instead of taking 30,000, I'm taking like 7,000, 8,000. So, but these are 6 weapons that only fire once every 2 rounds, and the other ones basically for every 12 of the energy weapons. So let's say that I'm currently taking 3,500, but I could be taking 700. Gives me 2,800 times 12 shots, so 33,000 extra damage. But then if I look at what am I saving for these, I'm going to be saving about 23,000 every time that it shoots 6 shots. And then if I kind of cancel those out, then I should be saving about 100,000 damage to my hull every several rounds, every 2 rounds, from using the S&W crew versus using the PMC crew. The other way to look at it is then what's the Talan crew. So if instead I switch to the Talan crew, what would the difference be between lowering these values to less than half of what they currently are, about 1/3 of it, versus the S&W crew? So that's kind of the calculation that you're trying to make. If you're fighting something that is doing most of their damage through the kinetic crew, then you could want to be looking at something that is like Talon, versus if you want to be mitigating everything, then S&W Pike is going to increase your shield deflection of that thing. But if you're in a fight, then when he increases your shield mitigation, you lose those shields. So if you're in a fight where your shields are already getting really low, you don't want Pike to add damage to your shields and deplete them. You want to use one of the other crews that's going to look at mitigating or reducing, suppressing what that damage actually is. So I think I went off I guess that's not really a tangent, but maybe it's more complicated. But that's kind of what you're looking for, is look at what you're fighting, look at these logs, look at where the most of your damage is coming from, and then that determines what crew you're going to want to move with. It's also going to help determine what your lower decks may want to look like. So in this case, for example purposes, I just kind of kept it clean, but there's a lot of those lower deck abilities out there that you can be using to do more damage, to prevent more damage, to increase your mitigation, to lower the enemy's mitigation, things like that. So there's a lot of options out there. You've got things like Badgie, which increases the armor penetration, shield penetration, and accuracy of your ship. So if you are not getting enough through their mitigation, he's going to help you increase that percentage by a bit. He's not a huge difference, but it does make a bit. On the other hand, you've got Boimler that is going to increase your mitigation. So in this case, if I'm running this crew, I don't need any more mitigation. So if I put Brad Boimler on there, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. So I don't really want to do that. Then there's other things, of course, you could do that will ramp up your damage. So Mariner is going to increase the base damage that you're doing out the gate. So again, the opposite of Suppression, that you're going to be doing more with each shot. So each shot that I may be doing for 1 million may end up being 1.1 or 1.2 million instead. And there's various things there. Odo can increase the amount that your crits do. Hugh can increase the chance that you're going to crit by quite a lot. He's one of the most powerful officers. So there's a lot of things that you can be doing to adjust on the lower decks as well. And many of the officers, you'll notice in that S&W crew, actually queue off the stats on the lower decks. So in this case, it's going to take 1800% of your total attack. So it's going to take, if my mitigation was not high enough, I was not maxing out at the 71.2, then I can add officers in there to increase what my attack is going to be, and that's going to give me more mitigation as we go. So hope that makes sense, and I think I'm going to do a follow-up to this discussing PvP, because you can get a lot more complicated there, particularly when it comes to the strike teams and how they each individually work, ways that you can come up with crews that kind of go around or subvert the strike teams a little bit, and how player-to-player mitigation is really quite a lot different than the PvE. It functionally is the same, but there's a lot more that you can do to raise and lower. There's a lot more effects at play when it comes to PvP combat. That does make a difference. So I'll probably do a follow-up there, but thanks for watching. I think this is already longer than I intended. Thanks.